And within days of the lockdown, we were getting many calls from women seeking help and advice because the lockdown had led to heightened experiences, particularly of emotional, psychological abuse, controlling and coercive behavior. At least, but on top of that, I also want to specifically talk about migrant women. At least 60% of the women that we work with have insecure immigration status. And some of these women are dependent on their partners or spouses for their immigration status, whilst others have arrived in the UK through other immigration routes. Most become destitute once they flee domestic abuse, and they find themselves unable to obtain safety through normal routes of access to alternative accommodation or benefits, mainly because of the no recourse to public funds condition that's placed on their entry into the UK. It's a legal restriction imposed by the UK Border Agency on people subject to immigration control, and it prevents them from accessing most welfare benefits and social housing. So breaching this condition puts a person's current or future right to remain in the UK at risk. And as a consequence, a lot of migrant women who have no recourse to public funds, who exit abuse, will find themselves in situations of homelessness and destitution. They're often forced to find other means of survival that are full of immense risks and dangers, or often they're forced to reconcile with abusive partners. Over the last 20 years, we have campaigned successfully for reforms in immigration law that allow abused migrant women the right to exit from abuse without fear of destitution or deportation. And the creation of the domestic violence rule and the destitution domestic violence concession have been important protection measures. However, significant as they are, they only apply to women who enter the UK on spousal visas, so they don't apply to migrant women who've entered the UK on other types of visas. And of course, it goes without saying that the no recourse to public funds is one of the earliest examples of the state's pernicious hostile environment policies, immigration policies, that has accelerated since 2012 at an alarming pace. And part of the hostile environment policy is also to embed immigration surveillance in all public and essential services, including healthcare, schools, social services, and other emergency services, and so on. And that's brought with it additional fears and obstacles for migrant women at a time when they're most risk of harm. It's brought untold suffering and risk of further harm in the form of marital captivity, forced destitution, forced slavery, indebtedness, and it's institutionalized racism and fear. It is a reality that we believe has been particularly exposed in the current COVID crisis, which is now why there is now a growing chorus for the no recourse to public funds to be lifted in its entirety. But the government has failed to, of course, heed to those calls to lift the no recourse policy even during the crisis. And it's left many migrant women in particular with a dangerous choice between staying in abusive environments during the pandemic or facing destitution and detention and deportation. Even prior to the pandemic, we struggled on a daily basis to secure safe alternative accommodation for BME women and migrant women in particular. Many refugees were unwilling to accommodate women with no recourse because there's a shortage of bed spaces, and most don't know how housing and subsistence costs for migrant women will be met, even if they accept them. Also, others are able to assist because they lack the expertise needed to deal with complex immigration matters. Just to give you an example, in England in 2017, there was a 30% shortfall in the number of refuge spaces compared to the minimum recommended by the Council of Europe. And of that, there was an average of just one vacancy per region for a woman with no recourse. Women's Aid statistics for 2017 also show that in 1 year, 4 in 5 BME women were turned away from refuges. And what little refuge assistance was available has become even less available in the present crisis. What's happened is that in terms of refugees, that many have suspended their referrals and suspended them within the first few weeks of the lockdown for a variety of reasons, including reduction of staff members, the need to safeguard other residents, or because of lack of move-on accommodation. Local authorities too have been slow to respond to migrant women with no recourse. Even where children are involved, they've regularly failed to meet their responsibilities and duties to safeguard for a number of reasons. The austerity is one reason, absence of adequate government statutory guidance is another, and a culture of deterrence, which is closely linked to the state surveillance agenda. Since the lockdown was announced, we've worked with 3 other BME organisations to support migrant women across England, and we collated the following statistics. Helpline referrals increased by up to 40%. Abused migrant women comprise 66% of our user base, but 77 of them have reported income insecurity, food scarcity, inability to access government schemes, benefits due to low earnings and loss of employment. 16% couldn't access healthcare for fear of detention or deportation, or were denied due to no recourse to public funds, despite some limited relaxations for COVID-19 treatments. 90% reported increased mental health needs, isolation due to lockdown and social distancing. And 39% didn't have safe access to phones and credit or the internet. And the overwhelming majority needed access to safe accommodation. So the burden of taking responsibility for supporting migrant women and children has fallen on the BME women's sector. And we've long had to resort to housing incredibly vulnerable women in B&B accommodation as an emergency, even though it's unsatisfactory. And we've also had to constantly threaten local authorities with legal action because of their failure to respond. So this is why we've campaigned with many others, demanding that the no recourse to public funds the condition be lifted, and to ease other and for the government to ease other immigration restrictions. We've received no response to any of these demands. And this is why on the 20th of April, we sent a judicial review pre-action protocol letter regarding the failure of the government to provide emergency accommodation, emergency funding for adequate accommodation for domestic abuse survivors during the crisis. We argue that in the context of a significant increase in incidents of abuse and killings, the current COVID crisis outbreak was an unintended but foreseeable consequence of the government's social distancing measures. Yet in spite of being aware of the risks, the government failed to take immediate measures or concrete steps to ensure effective access to accommodation. Even though the government made several announcements to support vulnerable people, abused women were not included in those announcements. And so in our protocol letter, we argued that the government failed to take reasonable steps to implement practice and effective measures to prevent individuals from being subject to torture, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, contrary to Article 3 of the ECHR, and that this constituted an unjustified interference with the private and family life of victims of domestic abuse, and that of their children in breach of Article 8 of the ECHR. We also stated that the failure to make adequate provision of safe accommodation disproportionately affects victims of domestic violence, who are disproportionately women, and constitutes unjustified discrimination contrary to Article 14 of the ECHR. We also argued that the government's failure to monitor and gather evidence and to review the impact of government guidelines on the lockdown for domestic abuse victims and to implement immediate measures for protection is unlawful and in breach of the public sector equality duty contained in the Equality Act. On 2nd of May, just 2 days before their reply to our pre-action protocol letter was due, the government announced an additional £76 million for violence against women and girls sector. Some of it was actually double counting because they'd already included that in previous announcements in relation to supporting vulnerable people. but some of the funding was marked for accommodation and support services. And whilst we welcome this, it's come directly out of the legal challenge that we threatened them with, what we're furious and angry about is that even this measure, even this announcement does not include funding for migrant women, does not include any help for migrant women with no recourse, nor does it explicitly ensure that some of that funding is ring-fenced for BME specialist organizations. There is no explicit mention of the need to ensure that local authorities and charities use the funding provided to ensure that there's safe accommodation and support for abused migrant women subject to no recourse. So this is where we are at the moment. And recently, many of you may be aware, the UK government published the Domestic Abuse Bill, which has been touted as a so-called landmark act that will offer much needed protection to all women. But in reality, it's failed to include migrant women, protections for migrant women who are on non-spousal visas and subject to no recourse to public funds. We're aware that also the Unity Project recently won an important legal victory in relation to no recourse to public funds policy, which ruled that denying migrant families access, in which the court ruled that denying migrant families access to welfare state was unlawful, as it breached Article 3 of the ECHR. The problem is that the decision only applies to migrants who are on the 10-year route to settlement and were working and can no longer work due to the lockdown. It doesn't help migrant women trapped in abusive households with no safety net. So what I want to say by way of conclusion is that in the current crisis, we're faced with this central paradox, which is that the very migrant people that the government has deemed disposable through the operation of hostile immigration policies, the migrant cleaners, the porters, the care workers, the delivery persons, are the very people that the government relies on to form the front line in the so-called war against the virus. This is why legal victories like the dropping of the NHS surcharges for migrant frontline workers and the extension of bereavement packages to NHS porters and cleaners are so significant. But this is clearly not enough. Far from allowing human rights to guide the response to the health crisis, what we're witnessing is a further entrenchment of inequality. On a more positive note, the crisis has shown that governments can be made to behave in a more humane way. Help can be provided to low-paid workers, those subject to abuse, and to hungry children. More hospital beds can be made available, as well as more money to those unable to work and shelters for those who are homeless. So our goal, I think, on the ground is to create meaningful solidarity between lawyers, activists, and others, so that we create a more human rights compliant system of governance, and to make this the new normal. We've seen glimpses of this, and the question is whether we have the imagination and courage needed to make it a lasting reality. And I just want to end by saying I can't help but reflect on the fact that globally, governments are waking up to the horrors of racism and discrimination by paying lip service to the slogan Black Lives Matter. But none of these governments will think of including migrants in that slogan. Thank you.
Thank you, Pragna. That was chilling, actually, and I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion about it shortly. Louise, I think Louise is next, who's going to talk about international implications, or some international issues arising in relation to the gendered implications of COVID. Lovely. I will, oh, I should say, I put on the recording partway through Pragna. I had meant to record it and then not recorded it. So I'm assuming the speakers are happy with that. And it's a flag to anyone who wants to participate at the end that it is being recorded. So I will give the floor to Louise now with many thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'm now regretting not having suggested that I go first after Pragna's speech, which was a really amazing overview of everything that's happening in the UK at the moment, in respect in particular of migrant women. What I'm hoping to do is look at how rights that we already have been and continue to be undermined, and in particular how that's exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and some of the international responses to that and what we may be able to do about it. And I firstly want to wholeheartedly echo the sentiment and the reality that we have to take an intersectional approach to the threats that women and gender rights are facing. In terms of a pre-COVID-19 scene setting, so before the outbreak of this pandemic, I was working with the Council of Europe on the Istanbul Convention, which is the Convention on the Protection of Women from Gender-Based Violence and Domestic Violence. And I've been working with them for some years, and that convention itself is under threat because of an approach to gender rights and gender in particular across Europe and wider. The convention itself defines gender as the socially constructed roles, behaviours, activities and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for women and men. And it has received a significant amount of backlash, predominantly from right-wing religious-backed organisations, on the basis that the use of the word gender is controversial, particularly in countries where gender has a different translation and a different existence. So in particular, countries that have classes of nouns quite often use gender quite differently. And the consequence of this is that women's rights and gender rights have faced a concerted threat from a rise in populism and the right wing across Europe as a whole. These affect not just discrimination against women, but also established reproductive, abortion and LGBT rights, which are under threat across Europe and the USA. A marked increase in racism and anti-migrant sentiment, which is coupled with laws being passed in various countries which parliaments knew would cause race discrimination. For example, the right to rent legislation in the UK and face covering laws in France. There's division being sown between different groups that are under attack by this general movement. And you see a clear example of that in the UK in respect of the division between trans rights movements and women's movements. And there's an increased reliance on religion by leaders of all faiths to justify gender discrimination. So against that background, we then have the outbreak of the pandemic, which is being used as a cover, as far as I can see, for the further removal of rights in a situation where we are less able to protest them. We have the example in Poland of using lockdown to avoid protest over tightening abortion restrictions. And then Hungary ended legal recognition for trans and intersex people very recently. And then you also see the USA throwing its global might around by defunding the World Health Organization, which is partly as a consequence of the inclusions of sexual and reproductive health as an essential service. So when you look at it in this context, you have a situation where a whole spectrum of women's rights across the globe are already under attack. And they're then much easier to attack as a consequence of a global pandemic, which requires people to stay inside. I propose to look at the various different additional impacts over and above the political consequences, starting with the safety impacts, which have been expanded upon at length in respect of the UK by Pragna. But lockdown primarily forced women to remain indoors with their abusers. And so firstly, you're in a more dangerous situation, and then secondly, access to support and other services became restricted or inaccessible. And you see that right across the globe, with an estimated minimum 30% increase in domestic violence. School closures put additional strain on women and girls. They prevent children in particular having alternative avenues for identification as victims of child abuse, gender-based violence, forced marriage, FGM or trafficking. In addition to that, in terms of economic impacts, women and girls generally earn less, save less, have more job insecurity, live closer to poverty, have less access to social protection, and globally form the overwhelming majority of single parent households. Employment areas where women are overrepresented, like healthcare, tourism and hospitality, are some of the hardest hit areas. So your economic insecurity to start with causes you to have all of these problems, but then you're more likely to have been made subject to laying off. If you're in the informal economy, you don't get access to worker protections. A further example in the UK is that nannies and cleaners appear to have been treated radically differently in terms of their safety in lockdown than other workers, with pressure for them to go back to work sooner, which brings in both class and race dimensions of a response to the pandemic. And long term, these economic impacts, so post-COVID, potential economic impacts are likely to increase risk of exploitation and trafficking, because economic vulnerability and poverty are push factors in respect of those. Health impacts, the initial data seems to suggest that men are more likely to die from COVID-19 in greater numbers than women, but other health impacts are felt disproportionately by women owing to resource reallocation and priority. And we already know that there are gender imbalances in access to healthcare. But in particular, sexual and reproductive health services and maternal health services, leading to an increase in risk of death and maternal mortality rates. This also impacts on the availability of gender-based violence services and intervention services, and is likely to have a significant negative impact on maternal mortality rates, adolescent pregnancy, HIV and STDs on a global scale. In terms of within healthcare, women are disproportionately represented in the global health workforce, in particular in those areas of the workforce less likely to have access to PPE or correctly sized PPE, and so therefore become more likely to contract COVID. And the stats on health worker contraction of COVID seem to indicate a massive gender disparity, with women more likely to contract COVID-19 than men. In terms of reproductive rights, if we look at what happened with the World Health Organization and the US and the UN, the letter that was written by the acting administrator John Barser to the UN Secretary General Guterres noted that the US was the largest donor of global health and humanitarian assistance, urged the UN to stay focused on life-saving interventions, and said the UN should not use this crisis as an opportunity to advance access to abortion as an essential service. Unfortunately, the global HRP does just this by cynically placing the provision of sexual and reproductive health services on the same level of importance as food insecurity, essential healthcare, malnutrition, shelter and sanitation. Most egregious is the global HRP calls for the widespread distribution of abortion-inducing drugs and abortion supplies, and for the promotion of abortion in local country settings. And so there was an attempt, which has been followed through, to use the coronavirus pandemic as a political tool to achieve defunding of reproductive rights. And unfortunately, that ultimately ended in the US withdrawing its funding for the World Health Organization. So in the face of all of this, what can we do? We can respond to the call for evidence by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. This call for evidence has got 11 questions, which range over the extent of the increase in violence, the availability of helplines, exemption from restrictive measures, whether shelters are open and available, availability of protection orders, impacts on women's access to justice, women's access to health services, obstacles encountered to prevent and combat domestic violence, examples of good practices and other things. And keep at the forefront of all of the work that we do, that human rights should be indivisible and universal, available without discrimination, and it all demonstrates the pressing need for an intersectional response to structural and institutional patriarchal oppression. And I would urge caution that without vigilance, we fall into the trap of allowing resistance to the idea of gender to be used to undermine all of our rights. And so I would ask us all to remember that and the political context that we're working in as we move forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise. And again, it's chilling, but at least there's some practical steps that that you've indicated that maybe will generate some discussion. Before that, we're going to hear from Elizabeth Prochaska. I neglected to say probably the most relevant thing about her, which is that she's a founding member of Birthrights, which is a charity concerned with the provision of with access of women to rights in relation to reproduction. So I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks, Aileen. As Aileen says, I set up a charity called Birthrights, which I'm often told that it's a kind of niche interest working on pregnant and birthing women's rights. But actually, of course, the large majority of women will be pregnant and many of them will give birth during those lives. So it's not really a niche, but in the kind of rights world, reproductive rights have been pretty much limited to abortion for a very long time, and people haven't thought so much about the end of pregnancy and childbirth. So Birthrights has been going for about 7 years. And I hope I'm sharing my screen with you all so you can see the very brief set of slides that I've prepared. And so prior to COVID, a bit like Louise, I just want to set out some of the sorts of challenges that women were facing in maternity care in the UK. And the greatest challenge really was around ethnicity. And in a lot of ways, what's happened during the pandemic was, from our perspective at Birthrights, horribly predictable because there have been gross health inequalities in maternity care for ever since statistics have been collected, and they haven't been getting better, and in fact have been worsening over the last couple of years for reasons which are undoubtedly extremely complex. But nevertheless, the figures are grim. Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women, and women of Asian origin are about 3 times more likely to die in childbirth. The absolute numbers aren't huge. We're talking about 100 to 150 women a year, black women a year, but nevertheless, that represents a sort of racial injustice that goes beyond just fatalities, but to women's experience of maternity care. So there was a huge racial inequality issue prior to COVID. There were also issues around service restrictions in maternity care as a result of challenges in NHS resources. So at Birthrights, we regularly see the reduction in services at local levels in the NHS for pregnant women, things like elective caesarean sections, access to birth centres, access to home birth services and so forth. So there were kind of systemic challenges in the maternity services that have been going on for a long time too. And finally, I just wanted to touch on an aspect of maternity care that can be quite hard to talk about, and in some ways it's even harder to talk about when healthcare workers are being treated as saints, and that is the dehumanisation that can occur in healthcare services to pregnant women, and the way in which routine treatments are carried out on pregnant women without their informed consent. So those were challenges that we were facing sort of day in, day out prior to COVID, and predictably those challenges were sort of magnified by the pandemic, kind of in the same way that Pragna and Louise have been talking about pre-existing issues have been made worse. So if you look at racial inequality, obviously we know about the proportion of deaths made up by the BAME community generally as a result of COVID. But if you look at pregnancy, we know that 55% of pregnant women who are hospitalised with COVID are women of colour. So that's a pretty stark statistic. Again, it's not a huge surprise given what we know about maternal mortality statistics, but it is something that needs to be interrogated. And in some ways, and I think the issue of health inequality has been overlooked, both by organisations like my own, but by other BME organisations working on equality issues, and by the equality regulator where I used to work. Healthcare wasn't treated or given as much attention as, say, disproportionate arrest by the police or stop and search and that sort of thing. But actually inequalities in healthcare are so profound, and there is undoubtedly a connection with racism and race discrimination. Very difficult to talk about, especially in current pandemic circumstances, but we have no doubt at Birthrights that Black women in maternity care experience racism from healthcare providers, and it's something that we want to explore more, and we have actually just got funding to do a race inquiry starting next year. So that's a big issue that's emerged from COVID, but one that existed beforehand. Another is around disproportionate and blanket policies that were imposed on pregnant and birthing women during the pandemic and which continue. So we have particularly policies on birth partners. So women who were going into hospital to have their babies in the early stages of the pandemic, some hospitals reacted in a very panicked, knee-jerk fashion and said that women could not bring birth partners with them antenatally. So if they were being induced, for example, or on an antenatal ward, they couldn't have their partner with them. Some hospitals went so far as to ban birth partners in labour. They reversed those policies pretty quickly, but there was a moment when women in some hospitals were having to give birth without any birth partner at all. And we've seen birth partners being banned from operating theatres on the basis that there's a greater risk of infection in the operating theatre and so on. The proportionality of these policies from a human rights perspective, I think, is highly questionable. The addition of another person in the labour room is unlikely to increase your infection risk, especially if they're from the same household as the woman. If she's infected, then the healthcare workers will be at risk from the person they're treating as much from the birth partner. So there have been really, there was really, I think, a failure, perhaps an understandable one in the early stages of the pandemic, but a failure to think through the proportionality of these policies from a human rights perspective. There was a real emphasis solely on infection control and not on human rights. And again, that's reflecting something that Pragna and Louise have said, is that there has been a lack of consideration given to human rights principles in the pandemic, and that is true in the health service as much as elsewhere. And as I've said, it is difficult to talk about that given how important healthcare workers are now to all of us. But the decisions that are being made by hospital trusts and by the NHS have to be questioned, they have to be challenged, and they can't necessarily just be accepted without recognising the impact on human rights. A couple of other points about the impact of the pandemic on maternity services. There's been a real breakdown in translation services. So translation for women receiving healthcare, women who don't speak English, was already very poor. There was often had to use a kind of phone service to receive any form of translation. But the pandemic has put the translation system under such strain that we hear that it's really not functioning at all in many places. And of course, that means that women are unable to understand what is being done to them, what is happening to them at a really critical moment in their lives. And of course they, from a legal perspective, are unable to give informed consent because they don't understand what's happening to them. And drawing a connection with Pragna's talk about coercive relationships and domestic violence, of course, women in abusive relationships, pregnant women in abusive relationships, will not have the sort of access to the support that they needed in a healthcare context. So, for example, midwives unable to come to their homes to provide them with visits, and potentially having to translate through partners during labour, which can increase abuse and control. So there's been a real problem there in the translation services, which were already really a broken system, but the pandemic has put them under even greater strain. And finally, there's been a real denial of some forms of pain relief based on infection control. Again, so a lot of hospitals have refused the use of water as pain relief on the basis that there's a increased risk of transmission. The actual evidence for that has been very poor, and again it was a sort of knee-jerk decision without any thinking through the kind of human rights consequences for women in labour. So the question I pose, I guess, is what sort of breaches of human rights law do we see there? And I think, you know, at its most extreme, there will be breaches of Article 2 of the right to life, particularly potentially in the context of disproportionate deaths of women of colour, and many breaches of Article 8 and the right to make choices about childbirth that have been considered at some length recently in the European Court of Human Rights. There have been a number of cases around childbirth rights that have reached the European Court, not from the UK, mostly from Eastern Europe, where conditions in maternity systems are particularly disrespectful. But we know that Article 8 protects all the decisions that women make when they are pregnant and giving birth. And we know that the pandemic has had a real impact on respect for Article 8. So just to conclude, what would be the long-term effects of the pandemic? A couple of potential positives. We may be reaching a deeper understanding of inequality, of race inequality in healthcare. We may have sort of turbocharged, in language of Boris Johnson, the understanding of health inequalities, which is a very positive thing, and it's something that we at Birthrights had already been working on and thinking about a great deal before this happened, and we now feel, you know, that the work we're doing has potentially been given greater public prominence, which is great. Where does it take us? What, you know, the report that was published yesterday, I think, with a couple of days delay by the government, about the disproportionate number of people from BAME backgrounds dying of COVID, didn't give us any answers about why that disproportionality might be occurring. It only gave us the statistics. But I think we need to push for answers. Why is it that people from these communities are suffering more than white people? And we need to push past the mantra that it's all about socioeconomic inequality, that it, you know, we know that it's more than that. We know that there is race discrimination and racism at work in the provision of healthcare. We need to use COVID as an opportunity to explore that and come up with some solutions for it. One more positive that we've seen in maternity care is that quite quickly, when that statistic came out about 55% of pregnant women who were hospitalised for COVID being women of colour, the RCOG and RCM issued guidance for obstetricians and midwives about differentiating care according to ethnicity. So actually providing women of colour with a greater number of antenatal appointments, providing them with tailored information about the risks that they face. That's not really been done before in maternity services. And in fact, I don't think it's really done very widely across healthcare generally, but that's a really positive development, because actually it means that people understand much more about the risks that they face, and it educates the healthcare professionals about how to treat everyone as an individual, but take into account their particular risk profiles. And hopefully that is something that will stick in health services after the pandemic has passed. On the negative side, there is a real risk, I think, that restrictions will remain in place for longer than justified, that the combination of the pandemic kind of normalising restrictions in healthcare and maternity, plus the undoubted economic consequences, which will see less money in health services and less money in local authority services, means that there is a risk, I think, that some of what's happened in the pandemic may become the new normal. And we will need to be really hyper vigilant for that and challenge it where we think it's happening. One final positive, I did mention, I haven't talked about abortion at all, I mentioned it at the start, but there has been a really positive development in abortion services, which is that women are now able to access abortion care by video conference or by telephone call at home with a doctor and be prescribed abortion pills up to 10 weeks gestation for them to administer themselves at home. The government says that it intends to end that particular relaxation of the rules after the pandemic, but I hope that we may be able to campaign for its retention. So that is one ray of light in an otherwise slightly depressing scene. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Is it just me, or do you need to unshare your screen? You have unshared your screen. Can I suggest that Pragna, Elizabeth and Louise make themselves visible to the extent that they're not, and that anyone who wishes to ask a question raise their hands. And if I can see hands raised, I will invite them. Otherwise, I'll ask you to indicate on chat. So is there anyone who wants to ask a question or make a point, make a contribution? Okay, I'm not seeing hands raised, but I'm not sure whether it's because I am a klutz. Anyone want to indicate on chat that they want to ask a question? By hands raised, I don't mean physical hands raised, I mean using the little box to raise your hand. Any questions? If you just want to give your name, then I will unmute you if you want to ask a question.
So just for information, I've put a couple of links in the chat to the Council of Europe response, the call for evidence from the UN, and also the Gender and Development Network's list of feminist responses to COVID-19, in case they're of interest to anybody.
Many thanks for that. What about responses, any of you speakers, to anything that's been said by the other speakers? If I ask Pragna, perhaps you were the first to speak, so you haven't had any chance to respond. Any thoughts that strike you as a result of anything you've heard from Louise or Elizabeth?
Well, I thought they were really, really thought-provoking presentations by Louise and Elizabeth. Lots of stuff that I didn't know. I mean, I guess the question is, how do we remain vigilant? Because one of the things that we are expecting a surge in demand as soon as lockdown completely eases, and that's the other side of this, which is that things are as bad as can be at the moment. I think they're going to be much worse for us. We haven't had, it's interesting, we had a real flood of funders, rushing to fund sort of our organization during the crisis, and you're making additional funding available. And that really was important for a lot of organizations, particularly the smaller BME organizations who lack the IT infrastructure to remove, to work remotely, to transition to working remotely. And all of that's been really welcome. It's come not from the government, but as I said, from some funders. My worry is that post-COVID, I think that we have to be prepared for the fact that that kind of funding is going to dry up. It might even become really difficult with the economic, you know, as a result of the economic downturn, the recession that we're all expecting. And I live in fear as to how bad it's going to be. So I think the question for me is, you know, the way in which we remain vigilant is through a combination of being able to bring legal actions where we can, where there may be, you know, sort of that kind of space to hold the government to account, but also through sheer political campaigning and, you know, a mixture of both. And that's the only way you remain vigilant, in a way, is, you know, using those opportunities that arise to either defend some of the positive things or push back against some of the negative things that are going to come. So for me, the big question is, what does remaining vigilant look like?
Thank you very much. Any thoughts from you, Louise or Elizabeth?
So for me, on remaining vigilant, I think it's taking some of the lessons that I think some people are learning at the moment from things like the Black Lives Matters movement, in terms of looking at our own racism, addressing that when we're dealing with other people, looking at our own inbuilt prejudices and views of maybe sexual orientation, gender identity issues, looking at our own prejudices in respect of class and how they intersect with each other and create different series of different issues and problems for different groups of women. And so when we approach those as lawyers seeking legal problems, we appreciate the different problems and different obstacles that our client groups may have and the different kinds of responses that might be needed. That when we look at lobbying the government, we appreciate those differences, and that we make sure we don't get sidetracked by single issue, predominantly single issue, without recognizing all of these much wider structural and political issues that ultimately lead to sort of disunity and difficulties in terms of maintaining a non-discriminatory approach. I would also urge people to follow what's happening with the domestic abuse bill and the work that's being done by Southall Black Sisters and others, and think about writing to your MP about supporting amendments that are being put forward to protection of migrant women and non-discrimination. The non-discrimination provisions are embedded within the Istanbul Convention, which is one of the things that the domestic abuse bill is supposed to be designed to reflect. And they require support, assistance, protection, and various other things to be provided to survivors of abuse without discrimination, including on grounds of migrant status. And so there are very clear legal avenues to pursue a much broader protection approach than is currently in the domestic abuse bill. And I know that that is definitely one of the things that is being campaigned on and that people could get involved with.
Any further thoughts from you, Elizabeth?
I think that it's a really fascinating time to be a kind of human rights campaigner, because the pandemic throws up such a range of human rights issues, and then on top of that you have what's happening with Black Lives Matters, and drawing the kind of connections between those things, the kind of racial injustice in healthcare and the racial injustice, the systemic racial injustice that we have in our political system and our justice system and every other part, you know, bringing all of that together, I think is a challenge for all of us, and drawing those connections. So explaining, like, why is it relevant that you know, that more people of colour are dying of COVID and police shoot, suffocate, kill Black men? What is the relationship between those two things? And finding a way to articulate that as human rights lawyers and frame both of those things as about rights and respect is a challenge that I think I personally want to embrace, But it's definitely one that's going to require all of us to ask very, very difficult questions of ourselves and of the organisations that we work with. So thinking about the chambers that Aileen and I are in, which is almost exclusively white, you know, am I any longer comfortable in that working environment? What can I be doing that close to home in my professional life to challenge and change, through to the organisation that I work with, Birthrights, how we embed race in a really meaningful and systemic way ourselves. You know, so there are lots of questions that I think we all need to be asking ourselves to take advantage of this moment. But we're doing that, as Pragna says, with the threat of less funding, as lawyers, certainly as barristers, with personal financial hardship that we may all be facing. So our personal circumstances may be quite difficult. We may be, you know, struggling to make ends meet ourselves, whilst also having to confront some of the most complicated and challenging human rights issues we've ever had to deal with. So it is a huge challenge to all of us. But I think if we can build solidarity, and doing that remotely as well is a challenge, but if we can build solidarity between us through these sorts of groups and through our professional connections, then that's the kind of first baby step towards trying to meet that challenge.
Aileen, there was one other thing that I missed when I was talking, which is that one of the things that I noticed right at the outset was one of the first things to disappear was women's voices in the public sphere. And you saw it across writing, across social media. So say legal Twitter, for example, just became this festival of men's voices, and all the women disappeared as they went off to do their childcare and their caring responsibilities. And then the same's happened in academic publications, which some of them have reported receiving no submissions at all from women since the beginning of the outbreak. And the long-term consequences of this mean that the really hard fought gains that we've won over years are being set back God knows how long. And so you have this really visible reduction in women responding to public policy, public law and public life, which means that social status reduces, and then that in turn creates an environment where violence kind of flourishes because of this differential in power. So that's something that I think we can all be quite conscious of, and look at our female colleagues and think, well, what can we do to help? We know that you've got to spend half your time homeschooling your kids. We don't want your professional reputation to disappear. And I'm talking very specifically to the human rights lawyers who are present here. What are you doing to help your women colleagues retain their professional status and their professional voices?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Actually, that's a point which I expect most of us are conscious of. Right, well, I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I wish it could have been a happier seminar than it was, but I think it's given us all a great deal of food for thought. I guess what's part of me was thinking at one stage, maybe the extraordinary toll that COVID-19 has taken on particularly BAME health workers will generate some kind of positive change, but it may be that we have to be super vigilant to make sure there's not further backsliding, in fact, rather than expecting anything positive to come out of it. But anyway, thank you all hugely for doing this, and thank you everyone who has attended. And I think there'll be something very soon. The HRLA is going to do something very, very soon on the current catastrophe which is overtaking the States in terms of Black Lives Matter. So that, I hope, will be the next remote meeting. I've just seen two. Yes, well, in fact, there thank you, and there's two messages on chat. Why do we not teach civil rights on law courses? Well, some of us do. Many institutions do, but maybe not enough. And there's thanks to everyone for the insightful contributions. There's a clear impact of the crisis on various individuals, e.g. BAME women who are covered by more than one protected characteristic. Is the current regime anti-discrimination regime sufficient to ensure that regarding future claims, harm is both fully recognised and fully compensated? Well, I think I can answer that and say no. Moving forward, what sort of legal reform, such as a multiple discrimination provision or some other solution, is needed? Any thoughts on that before we go? Quick step legal reform on multiple discrimination, or something that is capable of reaching intersectional disadvantage?
I think the Istanbul Convention is going to be quite critical in looking and reframing, you know, the ways in which we ask for and demand an intersectional approach from statutory services, from government to various social issues, from violence against women to others. And that's why I think the call to include a non-discrimination principle in the DA bill is critical, as are some of the other amendments, because what they're trying to do is to make the domestic abuse bill quite intersectional in the way in which it looks and frames protections towards a, you know, group of women, and acknowledges the various intersecting inequalities that exist that make some women more vulnerable than others. So I think that's just one example. I think we've got to do more to interject whenever these kinds of reforms are being discussed. You know, we have to interject that kind of intersectional analysis and framework to try and widen scope of whatever reform we seek in law and policy, and to actually adopt a narrative intersectionality without necessarily using that jargon, but to adopt that language that makes it more accessible to people to understand, and to be able to feel that they can talk in that language when they make demands of the state, you know, especially around accountability and so on.
I'd agree with that, Pragna. I think it's as much about the narrative and all of us understanding that language and telling the right sorts of stories about intersectionality as it is about legal protection. I've never really been convinced when I was at the EHRC. You know, we had this ongoing discussion about whether we should be pushing harder for the introduction of the intersectionality provision, the multiple discrimination provision in the Equality Act. And, you know, we never really got very far on kind of working out what our position was, because it wasn't really clear that actually it was a technical legal failing, so much as it was a failing of lawyers and judges to understand the rich contextual environment in which they were working. And so I'm not a great believer in sort of legislative solutions to this. I think it is definitely about legal culture, judicial culture, and broader culture, understanding what makes each of us unique and uniquely vulnerable in whatever interactions we are having, be they domestic or with the state or social or whatever it is.
I completely agree with that. My immediate response was the sort of legal reform that we actually need is training of the lawyers and the judges and the decision makers and the government people to make proper decisions. We don't understand single forms of discrimination properly or adequately, let alone multiple ones.
Right, I'll take that away and and propose a future event on that very issue. So again, thank you so much for doing this and for making it, I think, a really successful discussion, and I hope to see you all soon in a real way. Take care. Thanks very much indeed.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.